The Way My Life Turned Out by Jessica Platner. Narrated by Brianne Bushes. From the author. I penned down these memories upon the request of my relatives living in America. Our conversations revealed their limited knowledge of our lives, and what they did know was often distorted. I strived to recount the tales of our lives in our country with an unwavering commitment to truth, devoid of embellishment or undue pessimism. And so it was, the story of our lives. With these memories, I aspire to fulfill in some measure my filial obligation to my father and mother, to pay homage to their memory, for it stands as the sole tribute I can offer them at this moment. Dad, I believe I am not alone in feeling a growing bitterness and regret with age, wondering why I did not ask more questions, did not show more curiosity, did not seek out what was so crucial and necessary for me, my children, and my grandchildren, what constitutes the history of my family. How little time, fate, allowed me to live alongside my father. I arrived in his life as a late and only child, was still in school when he disappeared from my life for 7 long years. And by the time he returned, I was a university student, preoccupied with my studies, matters of the heart, and later, my own family and child. Dad was gone when I was just 26 years old. When I began to write this book, I realized how little I knew about my father's youth. He was born in Poland in the Jewish shtetl of Sokolau Podlaski, near Białystok, in the year 1895 into a tailor's family, the youngest son who assisted his father in the tailoring business. He began writing in his youth, with his first poems published in 1918 in the Warsaw Almanac. From 1919 to 1921, the family lived in Lithuania. My father worked in a sewing workshop in Kaunas and was published in the magazine Die Vesp, the official voice of the Jewish Culture League of Lithuania. Later, he would say, Ich bin a Schreiber und a Schneider. I am both a writer and a tailor. Here in Israel, we met our relative Mordecai Platner, who lives in kibbutz Netzer Sereni near Holon. According to him, they were aware that there was a writer in the family, but he couldn't recall the exact familial connection, and there was no one left to ask. He also showed us a page in the memorial book kept in the kibbutz, listing the names of our relatives with the Platner surname who perished at the hands of the fascists. From my father's early poems, I discerned that his family was among the poorest of tailors, if not the very poorest, and his fervent dream was to escape this stifling existence into the broader world known to him only through books. And when the opportunity arose, he followed his sisters to America. Life across the ocean turned out to be far from the prosperous and carefree existence he had envisioned from afar. There, my father experienced the hardships of grueling manual labor, unemployment, and poverty. His sisters couldn't provide him with financial support, so he immediately began working in sewing workshops, and in the evenings, he studied at a Jewish teacher's seminary. Upon completing his studies, he taught at night schools. During the summer, my father worked at a camp for workers' children named Kinderland. He always had a keen understanding of child psychology and was an excellent storyteller, which later manifested into his children's poetry. It was in this children's camp that he and my mother grew closer. There, I believe, their love began to blossom. Although they had known each other since Lithuania, where my father would visit from Sokolau, they always reminisced about their time in Kinderland and their youth with such warmth and tenderness, cherishing those moments as the happiest time of their lives, and how they loved to sing the songs of that era and how beautifully they did so. In America, my father was published in Yiddish journals such as Hamer and Morgen Freiheit, and became one of the organizers of the New York Proletarian Writers Association, Prolitpen. His first book, What the Day Tells, was published in New York in 1930. In 1932, he had the opportunity to travel to the Soviet Union, a chance he decided to seize, especially since his poetry was already well known and appreciated by readers and critics alike in Minsk. Upon arriving in the USSR as a tourist, he was included in an international writers' delegation, which was established at that time under the auspices of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions. The delegation included Louis Ahagun and Elsa Triolet as the secretary from France, and Joseph Karol Last and Sandor Barta from Hungary. The delegation's route took them through the Urals, the Kosbas region, visiting cities and new construction sites. The writers met with workers directly in the factories, construction sites, and clubs. They were shown what the authorities wanted them to see, the aspects that were meant to demonstrate the advantages of socialism, the construction of the first 5-year plans, the enthusiasm of the working people, and the shock work. In Magnitogorsk, in the House Museum of the poet Boris Ruchiev, who accompanied the delegation, a photograph of the participants of this trip has been preserved. After the Urals, my father had the opportunity to travel through cities and towns in Ukraine and Belarus, where he met ardent admirers of Jewish poetic works. Poet Isaac Borisov, son-in-law of Samuel Galkin, recalled how, as a pioneer, a member of the Soviet pioneer movement, he listened to Isaac Platner's performance in a theater in the Belarusian town of Rogachev. On the stage, against the backdrop of a white screen, stood a young man with silver hair, casting resonant, energetic stanzas about the lot of America's working poor, about the hard everyday life of tailors, to whose guild the poet belonged. Dad was deeply moved and captivated by everything he saw. He sent enthusiastic articles to the journal, Our Achievements, and to the American magazine, Morgen Freiheit. At the end of the journey, all the members of the delegation returned home. Everyone except him. He decided to stay in the Soviet Union. He hoped that in a country where Jewish culture was flourishing, a path to free creative expression and to Jewish readers would be open to him. That decision drastically altered his own destiny and the future fate of his family. Mom. I know a bit more about my mother and her family. She was born in 1904 in Lithuania, in the Jewish town of Vilkaviškis, on the border with Germany, into a large family of 11 children. My mother was the 10th, followed only by her brother Meyer. My mother used to tell me many amusing stories about her childhood. Her memory was truly remarkable. When she was very young, her older sister was already getting married. The adults, preoccupied with wedding preparations, paid little attention to little Deverele. She got hold of a pair of scissors, and her fancy dress was soon transformed into lacy scraps. They lived in poverty. Feeding such a large family was no easy task, but my hard-working grandmother did her utmost to ensure everyone was fed, clothed, and shod. And oh, the bread she baked! When my mother brought this aromatic reed bread to school, everyone wanted to trade even their white rolls for it. Mother excelled in her studies, especially languages. During the years of the imperialist war, German troops were stationed in their town, and German language was taught in school. From then on, she remembered Schiller's ballads by heart into her old age. Mother had a beautiful singing voice and led the school choir. Once, for some misdemeanor, a teacher punished her and locked her inside the classroom after school. But he had to release her soon after because he couldn't conduct the choir rehearsal without her. Mother's older brother, Philip, was exiled to Siberia for his Zionist activities. He managed to escape, made his way through Switzerland, and was eventually smuggled into America. Gradually, he started bringing over many of his siblings to join him overseas. Mother left for America in 1924. With the help of her brothers, she completed her education at Syracuse University and began working. She and my father got married in the summer of 1928 I know that Mother liked Father's circle of friends, his somewhat bohemian lifestyle, and that they traveled extensively across America, from coast to coast, visiting numerous big and small cities along the way. When Father made the decision to stay in the Soviet Union, Mother supported him and followed him there. Her siblings, who had helped her during her years of education, were vehemently against her departure. No one even came to see her off when she boarded the ship bound for Europe. She traveled to Moscow through Germany in 1933. By then, Hamburg streets were already patrolled by squads of the SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, the brown shirts, with swastikas on their sleeves, creating an atmosphere of great unease. On her way to Moscow, she stopped by her hometown, Vilkaviškis, one last time to see her relatives. Then she headed to Minsk, toward a new and unknown destiny. She only knew that she was going to the Soviet Union, to a new, beautiful world where order and universal justice prevailed. If only one could know their future. Now, from the vantage point of my years and the life I've lived, I contemplate my parents' fate and their decision back then to trade a prosperous and comfortable America for a hungry, misty, and unknown Russia. I cannot unequivocally judge their decision. I initially thought it was madness, but then I quickly decided that I had no right to condemn them. They were not the only ones. They were not alone in going blindly into the jaws of the monster named country of socialism, deafened by echoing slogans. This is where the worn-out phrase is fitting. It's not their fault, but their misfortune. For they embarked on this journey with faith and hope. The first years in Minsk. Minsk welcomed Father warmly. It was a city with a rich Jewish culture. Jewish schools, technical colleges, newspapers, a wonderful Jewish theater with remarkable performers, and a radio committee. There were Jewish listeners and readers, those whom my father wished to serve, for whom he was eager to create to the best of his abilities and talent. He immediately began working at the newspaper and the radio committee. Soon he was admitted to the Writers' Union and was given an apartment in the city center. His creative output during this period was tremendous. He wrote poetry, prose, worked for the theater, and translated from English and German into Yiddish. During this period, he published books such as From America, From Two Countries, a poem about tailors, and translated Michael Gold's book, Jews Without Money, from English, as well as the Grimm Brothers fairy tales from German. Just before the war, he released a poetry book titled The Sun at the Threshold. He found companions, like-minded individuals, and friends. My father idolized Moishe Kulbuk, considering him his close friend and kindred spirit. He was friends with Zelik Axelrod, Eli Kagan, Easy Herrick, many other Jewish and Belarusian writers, as well as artists from the Jewish theater. Mother, too, found herself in demand. She became one of the first English language teachers in Minsk, immediately joining the faculty of the Pedagogical Institute and contributing to the creation of textbooks and teaching materials. In the early months of 1935, I was born, a long-awaited, tiny, fragile, and only child. I was named Jessica after my mother's friend living in America. I was probably the only Jessica in the entire Minsk, perhaps even in the whole of Belarus. How much trouble, inconvenience, and unpleasantness my name caused me. But that's a story for another time. My arrival brought significant changes to the lives of my not-so-young parents. I battled through all the common childhood illnesses and demanded a lot of attention. Mother worked from dawn till dusk, and Father was engrossed in his creative pursuits. Therefore, I was cared for by my beloved nanny, Agasha, my caregiver and protector. I remember how in the evenings, after performances at the nearby Jewish theater, not far from where we lived, performers would come to our place, and they would talk, argue, and play chess until the early hours of the morning. Most often, it was Uncle Vinagura who sat down to play with my father. For the longest time, I didn't know he had a first name. Only many years later, when he sent me a telegram, "Congratulations on your birthday, wishing you lots of happiness. Vinogura Heim," did I learn that his name was in fact Heim. So there they were, playing chess and singing at the same time. Uncle Vinogura would hum his melody in a bass voice, while Father, a tenor, would add his own trills. The others surrounding them would actively discuss chess moves. It was quite challenging to sleep under such an orchestra. They would lock me in my room, and I would knock on the door and plead, "Gashenka, my dear, let me out of here." Meanwhile, Agasha on the other side of the door would attempt to rescue me. From the stories I heard from the adults, I know about some of the adventures from my early childhood. This one time we had a field trip to the countryside with our kindergarten group. One boy found a beautiful, but poisonous, toadstool mushroom, red with white spots, and offered it to me as if it were ice cream. I immediately put it in my mouth and got such a severe poisoning that I lost consciousness. I urgently needed to be taken to Minsk and saved. The adults tried to reach my parents by phone, but they were nowhere to be found. So they called the writers' union, and Father's friends, Zalma Telesin and Grisha Bereskin, grabbed a taxi and took me to the hospital. They were my saviors. Another time, at the dacha in Ratomka, I was standing at the gate of our house when a wolf raced past me. It didn't go for me, but grabbed a lamb instead, though the commotion was terrible, as it all happened in front of the other cottagers. In those years, I was introduced to the theater for the first time. My parents took me to a children's play about Marina Roskova, the heroic aviator. She made a forced landing in the taiga, got lost, and wandered in the forest for a long time, searching for a way out. I was so moved by the play that I immediately composed my first, and I must say last, poem. Airplane, airplane, take off into the flight. There a little bear awaits. There goes Marinushka, singing songs so bright. Quite a masterpiece, right? My dad was thrilled, but that marked the end of my literary career. We lived in the very center of Minsk, on the corner of Uritsky and Karl Marx streets. I remember that peculiar apartment, whose doors opened into a dark corridor with numerous neighbors. For some reason, I vividly remember the layout of the rooms, the entire setting. When I described all this to my mother, she couldn't believe that I could remember such details. I fondly recall our neighbors, Mikhail Ivanovich Kovalenko and his wife Lida, who adored me and helped us greatly during the war. There was also our neighbor Yulia Nemirskaya, whose friendship we cherished throughout our lives. From the pre-war period, I remember a phonograph with records and Brem's book, The Life of Animals, with beautiful illustrations that I loved to browse through. My father adored listening to records. He would play Glinka's Doubt and Shaliapin's rendition of Oh, If It Could Last Forever, while closing his eyes and quietly humming along. There were many Jewish songs, often played for guests. It was a mystery to me how people fit into those thin records and how we could hear them sing. Our Uritsky Street led to the central Sovetskaya Street. There was a bakery on the corner, through whose windows one could see them baking fresh bread and buns. I would watch for a long time as a big mustached man in a white robe and cap rolled out dough, turning it into long white ropes. He would swiftly cut them into even pieces, connect the ends, and throw them onto the baking tray to form identical bagels, one after another. Later, he would take out the finished products from the oven, golden brown, with a heavenly aroma. I wasn't much of an eater, but I remembered that divine smell for the rest of my life. There was also a ballet school on our street. From our balcony, I could see the students in pale green tunics, spending countless hours at the bar. I would watch them, mesmerized by their movements, and even try to imitate them. They would notice me, laugh, and wave at me from afar. The bright years filled with poetry, music, and the wonderful spirit of friendship and creativity didn't last long. The end of the 1930s was drawing near. Perhaps I was unaware at the time, but in retrospect, it appears that even I was attuned to the undercurrent of anxiety, nervousness, and a foreboding sense of imminent, ominous changes in our lives. Yes, these were the times of the terrifying Stalinist repressions. My parents' friends, the writers, their wives, and children began to disappear. Moishe Kulbuk, Izzy Herrick, and many other Jewish and Belarusian writers were arrested. Then their wives, Aunt Zhenia Kulbuk, Dina Herrick, and many others. What a terrible fate befell these families. Moishe Kulbuk, Izzy Herrick, and other Jewish and Belarusian writers were executed in the same year of 1937. Their wives were sent to the horrific Stalinist camps without the right to correspond, branded as family members of traitors to the motherland. And the children, Moishe Kulbuk's son and daughter, were placed in an orphanage. His sister managed to get them out, but during the war, only his daughter Reichka survived. She was evacuated from Minsk with a daycare center, while the rest of the Kulbuk family perished near Minsk. The little children of Izzy Herrick disappeared after the arrest of his wife Dina. After being released from the forced labor camp, she never found them. We learned about the fate of these writers and their families much later. Back then, we could only speculate on who would be next. It was impossible to determine why my father, who had recently arrived from America, remained free during those years. The actions of the repressive authorities defied any logical explanation. As it later became known, a case had already been opened against him, but something went wrong somewhere. He was expelled from the Writers' Union, where he had been admitted not long before, and was fired from all his jobs. His membership in the Writers' Union was eventually reinstated, though. One thing I can say with pride, my parents always remained honest people, loyal to their friends. They did not turn away from the families of the repressed writers, and carried this friendship throughout their lives. And that is worth a great deal. Mother became the sole breadwinner and provider for the family. When I fell ill with scarlet fever, my unemployed father stayed with me in the hospital. It was also with my father that I traveled to Crimea, to Yevpatoria, to recover from a severe complication after the illness. Meanwhile, Mother was supposed to join us in Yevpatoria after her exams at the Institute on June 22, 1941. But on that day, the war began. The war. The first days of the war. The terrifying roads of war. These images flash in my sharp memory like frames from a movie. Dad and I hastily departed Crimea on one of the final trains, as the bombardment by Nazi planes had already begun. There were practically no seats left on the train. My father managed to place me on the upper bunk, at the feet of a woman with a small child, while he stood all night, holding me with his hands to prevent me from falling during the jolting. We traveled with dimmed lights for camouflage. When we passed through the Savage Esmis, someone lit a match while lighting a cigarette. He was immediately accused of being a spy. I don't remember what they did to him, but the panic was terrible. Everyone suspected spies and saboteurs in anyone looking suspicious. Even my gray-haired father with me, a little dark, slightly slanted-eyed girl in his arms, aroused suspicion. They would say, "He took some little Japanese girl and pretends she's his daughter." Footnote. The term Savage refers to the Savage Sea, a large system of shallow lagoons on the west coast of the Sea of Azov in Crimea, Ukraine. With great difficulty, we made our way to Moscow, where air raid sirens had already begun sounding. People were fleeing to bomb shelters, hiding in basements and metro stations. Around the same time, we learned that Minsk had been captured by the Germans, and we were terribly worried for Mom. Suddenly, a telegram arrived at the address of our kind acquaintance, Ega Schertzman, with whom Dad and I were staying. In the message, Mom informed us that their train was heading east towards Penza. We hurriedly left Moscow, but it turned out that the train from Belarus passed through Penza without stopping, continuing in an unknown direction. Dad and I found ourselves stranded at Penza station, sleeping on the floor in the waiting hall. Early in the morning, we were awakened and chased out onto the street for the station's cleaning. Some kind-hearted lady took pity on me and let me use the shower at the station's sanitary checkpoint. Footnote: the Penza station mentioned here refers to the Penza 1 railway station, a major railway hub in Penza, Russia. Dad decided that we needed to find a place to stay, but on our way to the city, we stopped at the post office, and miraculously, a new telegram from Mom was waiting for us. She informed us that she ended up in Mordovia in the city of Saransk. That's where we reunited. What a relief that we were together again, alive and unharmed. Mom told us how she managed to escape. Minsk was bombed right from the first days of the war. She left home wearing a light coat and carrying a small purse under her arm. Fortunately, her passport was in the purse, as she never made it back home. The city center was already engulfed in flames. At first, Mom went to our neighbors and friends, the family of the sculptor Brazier, and they waited out the first bombings in some basement. But Mom said she couldn't just sit and wait for the unknown, and she pleaded with the Braziers to leave together. I don't remember why they refused, but Mom left alone. The entire Brazier family later perished in the Minsk ghetto. Then Mom went to the Vinoguras. Together, they left Minsk on foot, heading east along the Moscow highway, knowing they were walking in the direction of Moscow, and that they were not alone, but in a stream of people. They reached the Kolodoshi railway station, where open freight trains were stationed. People were loaded into freight cars and sent off. Along the way, they were bombed, but these trains saved the lives of many, including my mother. How many families the war scattered? How many children were lost on the roads of war? Even now, after so many years, people are still searching for each other, hoping for a miracle. Mom was immediately sent to a rural school near Saransk to teach German, which was now in high demand. The village was Russian, quite clean and well maintained. In the first few months, there was still plenty of food. Before school started, Mom and Dad worked in the fields harvesting the crops while I played nearby. For lunch, they cooked a cauldron of millet porridge and ate it, washing it down with fresh liquid honey straight from the bottles. It must have tasted delicious. Later, we moved to Saransk, and Mom was taken on as a nurse in the evacuation hospital. Severely wounded soldiers would arrive there with bloodied bandages, missing limbs. They had to be cleaned, dressed, and transferred to the wards. It was very hard work for a woman. When they found out that my mom was literate, they transferred her first to the accounting department and then to the library. Dad initially found work in a sewing workshop. He approached the Writers' Union in Moscow, and upon a personal request from the first secretary of the Writers' Union, Alexander Fadeev, he was hired as a correspondent for the Mordovian Radio Committee. There, he even published a small book in the Erza language, Mordovian. Unfortunately, it hasn't survived, and I don't recall its title. During the first year, we lived in extreme poverty. Mom exchanged her only valuable possession, a watch, with her boss for a sack of potatoes. He would deliberately check the time on that watch in front of her every minute. In the early months of our life in Saransk, we rented a room from a mean and unfriendly landlady. It was a cold extension to her house, and as we warmed and dried one wall, the other would get damp. I fell seriously ill throughout the winter, and the consequences of that illness stayed with me for life. By the spring, we found another place to stay, with kind and empathetic people. They were a large working-class family. I even remember their surname, Seleznyovs. Our life with them was much better. They treated us well, sympathized with our situation, and helped us however they could. I remember the cold room given to Dad by the radio committee. It was impossible to heat this large walk-through room. Firewood was in severe shortage. In the middle of the room stood a pot-belly stove with a pipe leading out through a small window. This stove would glow red hot. Only then could we get a little warmth beside it. The pipe was also used as a makeshift frying pan. Mom fried dark pancakes made from bran on it, which Dad brought back from his business trips. Only Dad could eat them. On the coldest nights, they would put me to sleep on a cot in the neighbor's room. This neighbor had her own personal problems. She was the wife of an officer who was serving at the front lines, and a wounded soldier from the hospital would come to visit her. He had already recovered and was soon to be sent back to the front. Every time they had a romantic rendezvous, the same scene would unfold. He would place the photograph of her husband face down on the dresser, and then she would turn it face up again. I would cover myself with a blanket and peek at this struggle. I was friends with her little son. We played our favorite game, hairdresser, and once we cut our hair so badly that we had to be shaved bald. I was placed in a kindergarten where circumstances forced me to mature quickly, learning many valuable things. For instance, I found out that I was Jewish, and that was very bad, but still better than being a Żydówka, because being a Żydówka was even worse. I also learned that if the war didn't end, all of us Jews would be killed. That's why I was particularly eager for the war to come to an end. We had our little joys in kindergarten too. Evacuated educators and teachers came to work with us. They had experience with children, and they organized school plays and performances for us, with costumes, songs, and dances. We loved those events. On Lenin's birthday, I wore my dad's tie with small polka dots, just like Lenin in the painting. Everyone showed me off as the owner of such a wonderful tie. At the New Year's party, we all dressed up as snowflakes in white gauze skirts. And for May celebrations, we were dressed in costumes representing different nations, and we danced the traditional dances of those nations. But our favorite activity, little entertainers that we were, was performing for the wounded in my mother's hospital. We would enter the wards with severely wounded soldiers and sing, dance, and recite poetry for them. In each ward, I had a favorite patient for whom I would perform my favorite songs. They brought a parcel to my hideout, where the warmth through the cold did tear. My heart and my chest beat wildly, recalling the home I hold dear. On the envelope, message so tidy, only a few words did appear. For Sasha or Pasha or Yasha, regardless to me they're near. I would change the names, substituting the names of my wounded friends, and they loved it. Every time a train arrived with wounded soldiers, they were shown the film The Rich Bride, the only pre-war comedy that the hospital's projectionist had. How wistfully the wounded soldiers would gaze upon scenes depicting a time of peace, devoid of war. We will never forget the early years of the war, the discouraging news from the front lines, maps marked with retreats, and the trains overcrowded with wounded soldiers. In the summer of 1942, changes came to our lives. My mother was called to Yaroslavl, where the Minsk Medical Institute was being staffed. We hastily packed our bags and sent the only luggage we had from Saransk to Yaroslavl. Potatoes we had grown on a small plot outside the city. However, we could only send them by slow freight, and by the time the luggage arrived, the precious potatoes had rotted and had to be thrown away. In Yaroslavl. In Yaroslavl, the city often referred to as Yaroslavl, a little corner of Moscow, a historic city located on the banks of the Volga River. On every square, a church, and the oldest theater in Russia, named after Volkov. We were housed right in the building of the Medical Institute in a large auditorium. Yes, indeed. Everyone lived together, like in a dormitory. 8 families in one room. Some people had spare sheets that could be used to partition off from prying eyes, but most had nothing, and all families slept side by side. Men, women, children. I don't remember if there were conflicts or quarrels, but we, the children, lived noisily and cheerfully, finding our own unique ways to have fun. One of our neighbors was a physics teacher. He arranged a makeshift electric fireplace by placing white insulators on a stool and winding wires around them, following all the laws of physics. This stool stood in the middle of the room, near the table, glowing with hot wires, radiating warmth, and gathering all the residents of the dormitory around it. In Yaroslavl, my dad also worked at the radio station. True to my traditions, I fell ill with diphtheria, and in the middle of the night, he carried me, burning with fever and gasping for breath, on makeshift sleds across the frozen Volga to an infectious diseases hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save me. I was discharged from the hospital in spring when the Volga thawed, and that's when I managed to bring another illness, measles, into our overcrowded room, and everyone caught it together. But everything passes, and this nightmare eventually ended. By this time, the tide of the war had turned. The Battle of Stalingrad had already subsided. News from the front lines became more optimistic and even joyful. Everyone believed that it wouldn't be long before we returned to our Belarus, and a new happy life would begin. Talks about the opening of the Second Front were in full swing, and specialists with knowledge of the English language were needed. My mom was in high demand to teach English to engineers at factories, and she was paid in kind, with soap and sunflower oil. This was considered a great wealth. And one more vivid memory from life in Yaroslavl. The institute was predominantly attended by girls, and each one was considered a beauty. At least that's what our teachers thought. Right nearby, there was an all-boys maritime academy. We used to visit each other, organizing joint dance parties with live music. In every party, a cadet from that school would perform. He sang wonderfully, headlining the concert with the final song, as only a true star would. And every time the same scene would unfold. At the end of his performance, the audience would start chanting, "Tomnaya noch! Tomnaya noch!" And the announcer would come out and say the same phrase, "Tomnaya noch," after the concert. Footnote: Tomnaya noch is the name of the song "Dark is the Night," a famous Soviet song associated with the Great Patriotic War. It was originally performed by Mark Burnez in the 1943 war film Two Soldiers. But the crowd would not give up. Everyone knew that the audience would prevail. Eventually, the announcer raised his hand, silencing the hall, and the familiar words began to resonate through the quiet space. Dark is the night, only bullets are whistling around. Such clear words, such a soul-stirring melody. Along with the song, restrained sobbing could be heard in the hall. Handkerchiefs rose to wipe tears. Almost always, the singer performed this song for an encore. It was the climax of the concert, after which nothing more was performed. People didn't restrain their tears. They openly wept. I was a little girl, but these memories will always stay with me. Now when I hear "Dark is the Night," I don't see the famous scenes from the movie Two Soldiers with the remarkable Mark Burnez in front of my eyes. Instead, I see that assembly hall at Yaroslavl Medical Institute and those handkerchiefs rising to the eyes of the women who waited and hoped. It is one of the brightest and most touching memories of the wartime years. Summer of 1944, Minsk was liberated. I heard the news on the radio while all the adult residents of the institute were at the theater attending a concert by Gustav Ernasak's choir. I ran to the theater to be the first to share the joyful news with everyone. However, the announcer came out to the audience and made the announcement, knowing that there were many people from Minsk in the hall. Immediately, everyone began to prepare for the move to Minsk. First, a representative delegation of department heads, including my mother, was sent for reconnaissance. They returned quickly and spent the whole night telling stories about the ruined city, the reunions, and their impressions. The stories were terrifying, but everyone decided, unanimously, we are going. We gathered our modest belongings in a matter of hours, and there we were, in the open freight cars on the way to Minsk. From Yaroslavl to Minsk, bypassing Moscow, we travel for 2 weeks. Fortunately, it was still early autumn, and it's warm. We stopped at small stations or at times even in the open fields, letting the oncoming trains pass. We would quickly take out our portable stoves, light fires, boil water, and cook potatoes. Suddenly, we would hear the call. All aboard! Departing! Immediately, fires are extinguished while grabbing the half-cooked potatoes from the pots. In this commotion, we even lost 2 water buckets and a kettle in the wells. But we were getting closer and closer to Minsk, passing by destroyed cities and burnt villages, witnessing the dreadful traces of war.
Темная ночь, только пули свистят по степи, только ветер гудит в проводах, тускло звезды мерцают.
Post-war Minsk. The war hadn't ended yet, but most of Belarus was already liberated. Minsk was a city of ruins, with smoke still rising from the rubble. Our first trip back into the city took us to see what was left of our home before the war. Just a pile of debris. Our dear house on the corner of Aritsky and Karl Marx streets, the distinctive balcony embracing the house was reduced to barely recognizable remains. A fragment of a wall and a bent balcony were all that stood. Caught in the balcony's bars was a child's toy, likely mine, but it was too high up to retrieve. This was the lone reminder of our life before the war. We were housed in one of the surviving sections of the campus of the first clinical hospital. The bridge across the Svishlich River had been destroyed, so a path was made in Gorky Park. Every morning, my mom and other medical institute staff would walk this path across the city to the government house. Footnote: Government house or house of government was a term used to denote a building that housed government offices, including those of the central, republic, or local authorities. These buildings often served as the administrative centers where government officials worked and where political decisions were made. We, the children, were sent to school. After classes, we roamed around the ruins, digging through them to find all sorts of interesting and useful things. Once, we found something resembling a kettle. And since everyone knew the Platners didn't have a kettle, they brought it to us. It turned out to be an old hospital urinal filled with dirt. We couldn't stop laughing. News of my mother's return to Minsk reached the newly established Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they invited her to work there. Along with the job, she was offered a room in the ministry's building in the city center. We lived in that building for 14 years, experiencing both joyful years filled with reunions and hope, and the most terrifying years that befell our family, but more on that later. Meanwhile, the first years were passing by in the ruined and now resurrecting city of Minsk. Perhaps it's a mercy that humans are not granted foresight into the future hardships, disappointments, and tragedies that await them in their lives. Otherwise, survival might seem impossible. After all, we thought that having endured such a terrible war and suffered such grievous losses, things should finally start to get better. When the long-awaited Victory Day arrived on May 9, 1945, a sea of people gathered near our home at the House of Government. Everyone was awaiting important news. We children hovered around the adults, wanting to see everything too. A soldier lifted me up and put me on his shoulders. I squirmed and accidentally tore a star from his epaulets. "Oh, sir, what have I done?" I exclaimed. He replied, "It's okay, little girl. We won't be needing these uniforms much longer. The war is over. Peace has come." I'd like to share a bit about life at our place on 24 Soviet-era Street. Many people in Minsk knew this building, which housed what was known as the government grocery store. One part of the building housed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the other part was occupied by the ministry's staff. It was like living in a commune. We shared a meat grinder, a laundry tub, clotheslines, and clothespins. Once, my mom and I bought a large wash basin at the flea market, and the whole building was happy, knowing it was meant for everyone. Together we made house-made noodles, shredded cabbage for the winter, and cleared the ruins, knowing that where old houses once stood, new, beautiful ones would rise, wide streets would appear, and we would live happily and joyfully. Later, some employees began traveling abroad, leading to a division between the wealthy and the poor. While husbands journeyed overseas accompanied by young secretaries, their wives remained behind. This arrangement fueled feelings of jealousy, leading to arguments that echoed through the hallways and staircases. Slowly, the initial post-war euphoria faded into the starkness of reality. War stories. Beyond the doorstep lay a liberated Minsk. How to describe those first peaceful years? Reunions with friends who survived, mourning for lost loved ones, tales from those who endured in the ghettos, fought in the partisan squads. The real stories were more powerful than any fiction. Themes and plots needed no invention. They engulfed my father, begging to be put on paper. One of my favorite poems, To the Musician, was dedicated by my father to the violinist Aaron Besmertny, whom he met in the first days upon returning to Minsk on one of the destroyed streets. The poem was beautifully translated to Russian by Elena Axelrod. Here are the opening lines of the poem. Klezmer, strike a tune without a word's trace, not on a violin so tame and mild, on wires strung like notes in space, above the street so dark and wild. And here is the chorus of a lullaby, sung by a mother over her murdered child, originally translated to Russian by Lev Ozerov. From blood and tears, I've woven a rope. The cradle hangs heavy, like misfortune's scope. Slain, who will return my child to me? I sing, while the wind whistles a harmony. Ah, la 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 la, la la. The heroines of the poem, Two Sisters, are the daughters of the pediatrician Aaron Simolovich Levin, Sofa, portrayed as Dina in the poem, and Galia. Their mother sacrificed her life to allow them to escape from a column doomed to death. The girls' elderly nanny, Mihalina, hid them and led them out of Minsk to a village. Later, Sofa joined the partisans while Galia lived in the village and tended to calves. After the war, Aaron Simolovich returned from the army and found his daughters. My father would visit their home, listening to their stories about the ghetto, the escape, and life with the partisans. Sometimes he took me along with him. Interestingly, the fates of the Levin family and our family became intricately intertwined. Sofa became a student at the Institute of Foreign Languages and was taught by my mother. Professor Levin, we discovered, turned out to be our neighbor and was our family pediatrician who treated my daughters. The girl's aunt, the poetess Edie Agnitsvet, translated this poem into the Belarusian language. My father also met with ghetto prisoners who managed to survive after its destruction by hiding in the Malina, the term used for a shelter dug underground within the ghetto area. There, women, men, children, and the elderly lived. There, they died from hunger and thirst. There, they were buried. It was a heroic struggle for survival. The stove maker, Pina, built this shelter, knowing how to ventilate it properly, but not knowing how long people would have to stay there, what trials they would endure, and who would manage to survive. The stories of these people form the basis of the novella From Underground, published in the Newman magazine only in 1986. In the preface to it, sculptor Zaire Osger wrote, "A soulful lyricist, A. Platner did not often turn to prose." The novella truthfully, even chronically truthfully, reflects the tragic days and nights of the residents of the Nazi-occupied Minsk. There is something in the author's story that I, for example, have not encountered in literary works, although I follow them closely. Perhaps the novelty in the presentation of a subject long ago illuminated by other artists is explained by the fact that the author is a poet. Fascism, with its preachings of racial inequality, drives a person into a dead end, underground, into darkness, strips him of the basic comforts of civilization, and finally, of the very right to life. How powerfully and impressively this is conveyed in the novella. In those early post-war years, my father worked tirelessly and productively. In 1947, a collection of poems titled With Love and Faith in Yiddish was published in Moscow under the editorship of Samuel Galkin. In 1948, in Minsk, a collection of short stories in Yiddish called The Most Precious was released. Later, a book titled In My Homeland came out, featuring his poems translated into Belarusian by poets P. Glebka, M. Luzhanin, N. Chernoshevich, and E. Agnitsvit. Here's another little memory. Sometimes, my father would take me with him to various interesting events at the Writers' Union. I was around 12 years old when he took me to a convention of children's writers held at the Young Kukapala Theater. Writers from many cities had gathered there, and my dad was invited because he wrote poems for children. I must say, as a child, I was very self-conscious about my short stature. In any lineup, at the Pioneer Assembly, during physical education classes, I was always last, or at best, next to last. And so, in the theater's lobby, my father was introduced to Sergei Mikhalkov, who was the main guest there. The towering figure of Uncle Styopa leaned down and shook hands with my father, who was of small stature. Suddenly, next to my father, he saw a creature even tinier. His astonishment knew no bounds. Seeing the living legend whose poems I knew by heart and loved, I began to circle around him, craning my neck upward. Mikhalkov turned around to follow me, and his face registered such amazement that everyone around us started to giggle. This scene must have indeed been hilarious, for it certainly etched itself firmly into my memory. Meyer. In the early post-war years, a joyful event occurred in our family. My mother's younger brother, Meyer, was found. I knew that my mother had many brothers and sisters, and that I had countless cousins in America, but they all seemed unreachable, like distant stars in the sky, almost unreal, like something out of a fairy tale. We started receiving letters with photos from him, and I looked at them the same way I looked at American magazines that Mom used to bring from the ministry. Beautiful, but implausible. And suddenly, a real uncle, my mom's only brother who remained in the Soviet Union, was found. After the liberation of Lithuania in 1940, he was arrested and sent to the Urals, where he, young and healthy, had to work in the most difficult conditions in the coal mines. A Bessarabian Jewish woman named Rosa took care of him. When his term of imprisonment ended, he decided to go to his native Vilkaviškis and find out about the fate of his family. On his way, he stopped by to see us in Minsk. He arrived in a terrible state, sick, dirty, and ragged. With us, he somewhat recuperated, cleaned up, and got some better clothes. His strength was returning, and he demonstrated it in every possible way. He would stretch out his arm, and my friend Valya and I would hang from it, pulling up our legs while he proudly carried both of us. I was happy. A real living uncle was now part of my life. He went to Vilkaviškis, where he learned the terrible truth about his family. His wife, a fair-haired beauty, and their 2 children, a son and a daughter, who didn't look Jewish at all, were betrayed by Lithuanians, handed over to the Nazis, and ultimately perished. There were no relatives left in Vilkaviškis. Only a small part of the house and a plot of land around it remained. Meyer decided to return to his hometown, but first, he went back to the Urals to retrieve his savior Rosa and her daughter Maya. Just like the first time, on his way to Vilkaviškis, he stopped by our place, this time with his new family. I came home from school one day to find our room cluttered with bags and bundles. Amidst the disarray was a tiny, frightened little thing with big black eyes peering out. I could never have imagined that one day this wild-looking girl would grow into a beautiful and confident woman, a mother of 2 daughters, and a grandmother of 4 living comfortably in Israel now. But back then, I couldn't find a way to connect with her, couldn't make her feel comfortable around me. Meyer took them to Vilkaviškis, which later became the home for his post-war children, son Ilka and daughter Itale. He settled them in a private apartment and began to rebuild and renovate the remaining part of the parental home. As far as I remember, this construction project of the century continued up until Meyer's departure to Israel in 1964, consuming a lot of money and effort. My mother and I visited her hometown for the first time in 1946. From my mother's stories, I knew Vilkaviškis to be a small Jewish town with cobblestone streets and houses surrounded by gardens. What I saw will forever remain etched in my memory. Indeed, there were cobblestone streets, narrow sidewalks lined both sides, from which low steps rose. But these steps led to nowhere. There were no houses, no doors, no courtyards, no people who once lived in those houses. Where houses once stood, there were now only even, grassy clearings, with occasional remnants of foundations and fireplaces, and nothing more. The entire town looked this way. Only a few houses on the outskirts had survived. We visited Vilkaviškis several times afterward, witnessing its revival, seeing it rebuilt with new houses and inhabited by new people. But they were not the same people, and it was not the same town anymore. The war had erased the Jewish Vilkaviškis off the face of the earth. Meyer worked hard for many years and accomplished a significant and noble deed. He erected a monument in the town's cemetery in memory of the Jews who perished. I hope that this monument still stands there to this day, and that no one will have the vile thought of desecrating the memory of the victims, as it happens in many other places. Vilkaviškis helped my mother and me during the hardest years. In his wooden suitcase, which he had brought from the Urals, Uncle Meyer carried fat geese to us, and my mother rendered goose fat from them, which sustained us during times of hunger. Oh, and the eggs Uncle Meyer brought. One of his hens even died while laying an egg, with a double yolk. He also brought wonderful Lithuanian apples, the white transparent variety. Everything in Uncle Meyer's house seemed particularly delicious to me. The bread, the cottage cheese, and the wonderful milk from Rosa's cow. Rosa would fry a big pot of cutlets, and the children would grab them without bread, stuff them into their mouths, and run outside. She also had a great sense of Jewish humor. Once, she took me to the market, bought a chicken there for, say, 12 rubles, but she told everyone we met that she paid only 10. When I asked her why she claimed the price was lower to others, Rosa said, "Let them say that Mrs. Rootstein is a good housewife, knows how to bargain." In Meyer's house, children were allowed to do anything. There were no prohibitions or restrictions. There was a large white table in the kitchen, and half of its surface was entirely covered in nails. It turned out that Ilka had been practicing hammering nails on that very table. My mother was outraged because the table was ruined, but Meyer casually dismissed it. No big deal, we'll get another one. And indeed, he truly admired all of Ilka's mischiefs, laughing as he shared the stories with us. Once, some soldiers stayed overnight at their house. In the morning, they tried to put on their boots, but couldn't fit their feet into the shafts. Still groggy, they couldn't figure it out at first, only to discover that Ilka had stuffed potatoes in there. Ilka was a handsome boy with gray eyes, perpetually smiling and brimming with cleverness. He didn't speak Russian, he just smiled and convinced everyone to play checkers with him, which he called shashkis. I enjoyed strolling with him around Minsk, visiting my friends. I was very proud of him. I loved it when my uncle and his family came to visit us, and I loved visiting them. Years later, my husband and I even chose Volkovishkis as our honeymoon destination, where they welcomed us like royalty. When Meyer decided to move to Israel, I was truly saddened, because once again, I was left without close family. Meyer was very religious and yearned to go to Israel. However, relocating abroad during that period presented considerable challenges. It was 1964, and mass emigration to Israel and America had not yet begun. Apart from his family, there were no other Jews in the town, so despite friendly relations with the Lithuanian neighbors, my uncle feared for his children and sent them to us in Minsk, while he sorted out the departure arrangements. Immediately, an article about his family appeared in the Lithuanian newspaper, mentioning that they had sent their children to their aunt in Minsk. They were slandered in any way possible, as was customary in our humane country. The farewell was heart-wrenching. Once again, all my relatives were far away, and the prospect of reuniting with them seemed like an unattainable dream. We were only destined to meet again after more than 40 years. Meyer was the first person we visited in Israel. After a severe stroke, he had been in the hospital for several years, unable to recognize anyone. Shortly after our visit, he passed away. Rosa had left this world much earlier. But life goes on. Meyer and Rosa's grandchildren are growing up in the land of Israel. I doubt I will ever visit Volkovishkis again. That is so dear to my heart. Let it remain in my memory as the ancestral nest of my mother's large family, as the town where I felt the bond of ages. Life has changed. My mom and dad wanted to move to Moscow, where the Writers' Union had a large Jewish section. I don't know why those plans never came to fruition, but I do remember that Dad often traveled to Moscow and stayed there for long periods of time, looking for an apartment and a job for himself and my mother. In the summer of 1947, he arranged for me to attend a pioneer camp organized by the Writers' Union. This summer camp was located in the Moscow region, about 100 kilometers from Moscow along the Mozhaisk Highway, where some of the fiercest battles had recently taken place. It was a cheerful camp with lively counselors and my wonderful friend, Zhenya Kozakevich, the daughter of the writer Emil Kozakevich. They also called me Zhenya there, and we were so inseparable that we even planned an escape together. Our fathers found out and panicked, came in Kozakevich's car to thwart our plans. Once, our camp was robbed, and all the food supplies were stolen, leaving us only with cabbage. Our resourceful cooks prepared this cabbage for us in various ways for several days, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Our equally inventive counselors took us to the forest to gather wild food, raspberries. I have never seen raspberries like that in my life. The forest was literally red, the branches bent under the weight of the berries, almost touching the ground. We feasted on overripe raspberries until we were simply intoxicated by them. We kept finding rusted weapons, perforated helmets, and decaying soldiers' uniforms. The local residents were afraid to venture into these woods, so all the raspberries were ours for the taking. But let's return to Minsk in the second half of the 1940s. Many Jewish writers, my father's friends, who had previously lived in Minsk, visited our home, telling stories about their wartime experiences, about the friends they lost, and about their plans to return to Minsk. I remember Motya Grubian, Moishe Taif, and Mendel Lifshitz. However, they never made it back to Minsk. It soon became clear that reviving the Jewish section in the Belarusian Writers' Union was not going to be possible. I remember a particularly striking episode when my father and his friends, the poet Hersh Kamenetsky and journalist Hersh Smolyer, a partisan and author of a book about the Minsk ghetto, returned from a reception with P.K. Ponomarenko, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Belarus. They had spoken to him about the dire situation of Jews in post-war Minsk, about the significant contribution of Jews to the fight against fascism, and about the need for assistance to create normal living conditions. They all returned in a dejected state, shocked by the harsh reception and the unjust accusations made against them. Here's an excerpt from the article, How Forgeries Were Fabricated, by M.S. Norstein and Y.Z. Basin, describing this meeting, based on the memories of H. Smolyer. Ponomarenko listened to what Smolyer was saying very attentively, didn't write anything down, didn't ask a single clarifying question. He only asked Platner and Kamenetsky if they wanted to add anything. They replied that they agreed with everything that had been said. Uncontrollable anger flashed in his piercing eyes. You are to blame for inciting Jewish nationalism, against which we will take the most decisive measures. And how else can we characterize your program? He was referring to the document that proposed specific measures for creating living conditions for a people almost entirely annihilated during the years of occupation. And your nationalistic gatherings? And your little gangs lurking in their hideout? A reference to a literary morning book clubs where poets read their poems, and to a self-defense unit created to protect Jews from bandits on the streets and at the market. And finally, the question, why do people hate you so much? The conversation with the party leader was unfruitful. Instead of discussing the political situation in the Republic, it turned into a repetition of anti-Semitic myths. Silently, 3 Jewish writers walked the nocturnal streets of Minsk. The first to break the oppressive silence, recalled Smolyer, was Isaac Platner, who seemed to speak not to us, but to the brick rubble under our feet. Today, a death sentence was passed on all of us. Stunned, I stopped in the middle of the street and lashed out at Isaac with epithets like alarmist, crybaby, and so on. Hersh Kamenetsky, always a man of few words, after my indignant tirade, calmly said, "Calm down. Isaac is right." It was a dire warning, and the future would show just how right my father was. But more on that later. I'll just add that Smolyer left Belarus for Poland. During these years, my mother worked at the Minsk Pedagogical Institute and simultaneously at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This ministry was established in Minsk because Belarus, as a war-affected country, became a member of the United Nations. They wanted my mother to be part of the delegation for the first UN General Assembly in San Francisco. But plans changed, and she was denied the opportunity. However, she was entrusted with another responsibility. She taught English to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kiselev, and to the son of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Belarus, Ponomarenko, to prepare him for the university entrance exams. She was also trusted to translate trophy films directly from the screen at the government house and at Ponomarenko's residence. Footnote: Trophy films refers to movies that were captured or seized by the Soviet Union from Nazi Germany or its allies during or after World War II. These films could include a range of genres and origins, including Hollywood movies that were not accessible in the Soviet Union due to the war and pre-war bans, as well as European films. They were called trophy because they were considered spoils of war, brought back as part of the vast amount of cultural, technological, and intellectual property taken by the Soviet forces as they advanced through Europe. The screening of such films, especially in the immediate post-war period, would have been a significant event, often limited to high-ranking officials and selected audiences due to the scarcity and ideological control of foreign media in the USSR. I want to tell you a bit more about my mother's lessons with Ponomarenko's son. Several times a week, a car would come for my mother and take her outside the city to Ponomarenko's dacha. When my father went to Moscow, my mother was afraid to leave me alone. It was the time of the Black Cats and other criminal gangs, so she used to take me with her. I remember those trips very well. We would pass through several checkpoints. The military would stop the car, shine a flashlight in our eyes, open the gates, and let us through. I was always afraid that they wouldn't let the car pass because of me, that I was the uninvited extra. But we would proceed and enter the territory of the dacha. In the large, main building lived the Ponomarenko family, and in a smaller house was a library where my mother tutored her student. There were some other buildings around, all enclosed by a high fence beyond which lay a luxurious pine forest. I was given books and told to sit quietly. It was boring and tedious. Once, after their lessons, we were invited to the big house for tea. In the huge dining room, on a massive table, stood an enormous cake. They served me a piece on a plate, but I didn't know that such a fresh cake had to be eaten with a spoon, as I had never before had the opportunity to eat anything like it. I ended up not eating this appetizing piece, which I regretted for a long time. The house had its own private home theater, where my mother translated the trophy films. The funniest part was that neither my mother nor the other teachers who were preparing Ponomarenko's son for university were ever paid. However, once they did give my mother a voucher for some firewood. And one more memory remained from those lessons. A German trophy painting that the owner himself gifted to my mother. Among the vast number of paintings displayed in the hall, my mother liked a still life painting depicting a vase with flowers. But Ponomarenko rejected my mother's choice and replaced it with another painting. This one featured 3 graces, portraying 3 semi-naked beauties near a forest stream surrounded by woodland animals. Oh, how beautiful it was, and how starkly it clashed with our humble surroundings. 3 girls, a blonde in blue, a brunette in pink, and a dark-haired woman in green. My neighbor and friend Valya and I admired this painting, concocting various stories about these beauties, imagining ourselves in their place. During renovations, the painting was moved to the balcony. It got caught in the rain, and with that, the forest idyll came to an end. Not just the painting was lost. There would be more to regret later. This lyrical digression in no way reflects the mood and overall atmosphere that prevailed in our family during those days. I would overhear the conversations of the adults, witness the nervous and tense state of my parents and their friends, and sense the mounting anxiety. The years of repression. It was January of 1948. On that winter morning, my father and I were on our way to a doctor who was seeing patients at the Lit Fund, when suddenly, on Engels Street, a familiar actor from the Jewish theater called out to him, "Isaac! Isaac! Michoils has been killed!" Immediately, my father instructed me to go home and rushed off somewhere with that actor. Footnote: in the Soviet Union, the Lit Fund, short for Literary Fund, was an organization designed to provide support to writers, scholars, and other intellectual workers. This included financial assistance, health benefits, housing allocations, and other forms of social assistance. The dreadful news had shaken Minsk to its core. Roadblocks and inspections of drivers and their vehicles were set up across the city. Various rumors circulated, even though everyone knew it wasn't a mere car accident, and they also knew that the culprits would never be found. My father wrote a story memoir in Yiddish right after these events took place, titled Mikhail's Last Role. Only years later, in Israel, did I learn that Dad's memoir circulated in Minsk, passed from hand to hand. A Minsk journalist gave me a copy of this story on aged yellowed paper, preserved by him all those years. Here I offer the text, first translated from Yiddish to Russian, and subsequently from Russian to English. Mikhail's last role. That morning, the entire city lay buried under a blanket of snow, engulfed by a wintry onslaught, and the people looked as if they had just emerged from this deluge, taking their first steps on the snow-covered ground. Trams labored through the deep drifts, while cars, like large flies dusted with snow, trudged along the snow-laden roads, with their suspensions fluttering. Houses stood, weighed down with heavy snowcaps atop their roofs. I struggled to move my legs through the deep snow, when suddenly, near the theater square, out of the white darkness emerged several actors from the Jewish theater. Their faces were agitated, terror in their eyes, and without any preamble, they blurted out to me, "Mikhail's has been killed!" Any thoughts about the snowstorm, about what was happening around me, vanished in an instant. My entire being was suddenly consumed by one question. Mikhail's has been killed? There was no other thought in my mind, my heart or my soul, except Mikhail's is dead. We all went to the morgue, where the murdered Mikhail's lay. We were a small group. Myself, the old actor from the Jewish theater, tradesman, and several young actors who were former students of the Moscow Theater Studio and now worked at the Minsk Jewish Theater. In a deserted corner of a large hospital yard stood a small, somber, one-story house with grim windows and a heavy door. The morgue looked like a prison for the dead. The door was secured with a large, heavy lock, as if the dead could escape from there. A young orderly, whom we found on the snow-covered paths, opened the door. Right by the entrance lay Solomon Mikhail's. He was wearing a coat, one lapel overlapping the other, with his legs protruding from under it. He wore a shoe with a galosh on one foot, while the other foot had only a sock. The second galosh lay nearby. I don't remember if the other shoe was there too. Mikhail's uncovered head lay in the coat's collar, hatless. His eyes were closed, as if lost in thought, and his lower lip, so familiar to us from photographs and the roles he played on stage, was slightly drooping, as if he was offended by someone. His left cheek was marked with bruises and swollen, as if from a hemorrhage. Mikhail's looked as though he was playing a grand role, his last role, completely alone, without fellow performers. He was the playwright, the director, the actor, and the audience all in one. His final act. Who can truly say what battle unfolded between him and death? It seems he must have struggled against someone. Only a person locked in a fierce battle against overwhelming odds could appear so battered. Despite Mikhail's physical strength and formidable muscles, he was unable to overpower his assailants. Doctors arrived to perform the autopsy. Among them, a young woman. She contorted her face into a terrible grimace and asked what could have happened to Mikhail's. The doctor replied, "A car ran over both of them." In the far corner of the morgue lay another person who had died that night alongside Mikhail's. They were run over by a car. The young women, students from the studio, were wringing their hands, crying bitterly. Tradesman was silent, and I looked at Mohoyles. Perhaps he would say something? But the orderly, a young man in a white coat, blurted out with a sob in his voice, a tone of grievance, as if seeking justice from someone. "Yes?" he said, choking back tears. "A car? Look at this!" He lifted Mohoyles' head with both hands, slightly turning it towards us to show. Right in the middle of the skull was a deep hole the size of a fist, 3 fingers deep. Clearly the hole had been made with a blunt piece of iron, which had been brought down on the head with great force, not once, but several times. The orderly gently placed the head back in its place, and we all stood around in silence. We didn't even dare to raise our heads and look at each other. I took one last look at Mohoyles as he lay there. In an instant, a gallery of characters he had portrayed on stage flashed before my eyes. I looked at his lowered lip and saw him play Benjamin, saying to Zuskin, "Do you hear, Sanderl? Do you see what can happen?" When he played Tevi, saying, "Do you know there is a God in this world? I'm not talking about my God, your God. I'm talking about our common God, who sits up there and sees all the vileness done here on earth." When he played Alter and Mazel Tov, when he played Shim's Soroker, the deaf man, Avades, Dr. Jacobi, when he portrayed King Lear amid a snowstorm where the wind tore the royal crown from the king's head. But now, Mohoyles was playing his final role. In one shoe and a galosh on one foot, the other foot bare. Comedian, Mohoyles, as he himself referred to actors, was now playing his last act. I wanted to memorize his image and looked at the great master for one last time. The legendary actor, Mohoyles, a descendant of Jewish culture and heritage. The profound thinker, Mohoyles, the wise Mohoyles, ever ready for sacrifices, Mohoyles, the sacrificial Mohoyles. We were instructed to leave the morgue, and the doctors began the autopsy on Mohoyles' body. Minsk, 1948. In Y. Kosterchenko's book, In the Clutches of the Red Pharaoh, there was a phrase, "Mohoyles' death is the result of a deliberate and meticulously planned murder." It continues. Later, Pfeffer told an investigator that soon after Mohoyles' death, he met in Minsk with the Jewish writer Isaac Platner, arrested in 1949, who confessed that none of the Jews in the Belarusian capital believed the actor's death was accidental and consider it an officially orchestrated assassination intended to decapitate the Jewish community. Thus began a new chapter in the history of the Jews in the USSR. I believe my father knew what awaited him. He was a highly emotional person, keenly sensitive to and aware of the surrounding atmosphere, and, in general, was prepared for anything. Yet the blow invariably comes without a warning. On the night of June 8, 1949, they came. For the older generation, life is divided into pre-war years, the war, and post-war life. For us, a new milestone emerged, the arrest. I will never forget that night. There were 3 of them, dressed in gray. They operated smoothly, silently. One sat at the table and took notes, while the other 2 moved around the room. They called a neighbor to be a witness. The search began with the writing desk and bookshelves. Like many, we had complete collections of Lenin's and Stalin's works. They pulled each volume from its case, leafed through it, then turned the case upside down, tapping it on the table, to see if any papers would fall out. All of my father's manuscripts in Yiddish, the typewriter, and some other papers were placed in a wardrobe and sealed with sealing wax. They said they would send someone who knew Yiddish. We were left without our belongings that got locked inside the sealed wardrobe, but our neighbor helped us out. He carefully removed the back panel of the wardrobe, and we managed to retrieve our clothes from it. As a 14-year-old girl, well-versed in classic literature, I was convinced that if they found nothing, these people would leave and everything would return to normal. But they left with my father at dawn, just as the sun began to rise. We were not allowed to go out and see him off. We stood on the balcony and watched as he was placed in a car between two men in gray. The car drove away, and my father disappeared from our home for 7 long years. Only later did we learn that on that sunny, fresh, and clear morning, he was taken to the internal KGB prison on Volodarsky Street. There, under the supervision of L.F. Sinava, the Minister of Internal Affairs, and Beria's deputy in Minsk, a terrible, endless interrogation began. My father was met with a barrage of insults and was immediately ordered to be beaten. He was taken to the basement and, without any charges being pressed, beaten until he lost consciousness. In the subsequent interrogations, a rubber whip was always on the table, accompanied by cynical insults and beatings. For 2 months, he was not allowed to sleep, interrogated from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., with threats to arrest his wife and daughter. The interrogation was conducted by a colonel and a lieutenant colonel. One would stand on his neck, the other on his legs, and they would beat him relentlessly. To escape the torture, he confessed that he had been recruited by Moisey Olgin. According to the investigation materials, when Mohoyles and Pfeffer were in America in 1943, Olgin allegedly recommended them to use Platner in espionage work. However, Olgin had died before the war, in November 1939, and his obituary was published in the newspaper, Pravda. Several years later, it became known that on August 12, 1952, members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, prominent figures in Jewish community, were executed in the KGB prison in Moscow. We all knew their names. Among those executed were Joseph Vandenberg and his wife, Chaika Vattenberg-Ostrovskaya. I had heard these names from my parents and knew that they were close friends from America who came to the Soviet Union at the same time as my mother. Chaika served as a technical secretary and translator at the JAC. They were executed as American spies. I think that if my family had moved to Moscow and my father had been arrested there instead of Minsk, he would have stood alongside his writer friends at the execution wall at Lubyanka. Also from G. Kostrachenko's book, in Belarus, the MGB authorities identified and exposed a nationalist group led by I. Platner, a member of the Union of Soviet Writers of Belarus. I. Platner lived in America until 1930, where he was a member of the nationalist organization Poale Zion and participated in the International Congress of Zionists. That morning, when they took Dad away, Mom and I were left alone in our apartment, which was a mess after the search. What were we to do? How were we to carry on? I was finishing 6th grade at the time and preparing for a botany exam. I ran to my school friend Zina, with whom I had been studying, but I couldn't concentrate. Nothing would stick in my mind. So I told everything to Zina and her mother. They didn't send me away. They didn't turn their backs on me. And that was a true act of courage. Some acquaintances stopped greeting us, would turn away on the street, pretended not to know or recognize us. I guess I can understand them, given the terrifying times. People were afraid of their own shadows. Being connected or merely acquainted with a so-called family of an enemy could cost you your freedom. I will always be grateful to you, my dear school friends, Zina, Eda, Lena, Renia, and to your parents as well. Thank you for preserving my faith in goodness and humanity. My mother immediately took action. We needed to find out where my father was, how to send him parcels, and what he was being accused of. In Minsk, everyone knew that dreadful place, the prison on Volodarsky Street, where even on the hottest summer days, an icy chill lingered in its deep alleyway. Every Sunday morning, we would go to the grim iron gates to drop off a small package and gather any information we could. The same people always gathered there. Everyone knew each other by now. Relatives of the detained exchanged scant information and rumors. Notes from the prisoners were rare. We were only allowed to write a few words. We are alive, we are healthy, and what we were sending in the package. But what was there to write anyway? Even for us, on the so-called outside, there was no joy. My mother was immediately dismissed from her job. She wasn't even allowed to conduct final exams for her students. We were asked to vacate our decent room, and were moved into a tiny cell-like space, more akin to a storage closet. Well, at least we weren't thrown out onto the street. The investigation into my father's case dragged on for a long time. Then the investigator went to Moscow and returned with the words, "They are very strict with your kind over there." When the investigation concluded, a swift trial, or rather a special meeting, was held. Terrible accusations were leveled against my father. Espionage, treason, anti-Soviet underground and nationalist activities. He received the harshest sentence, 25 years in a maximum security penal colony, and he was already 55 years old at the time. It was said that when a husband is sentenced to 25 years, they take away his wife too. My mother knew well that in such cases, the children were immediately sent to an orphanage. So she had an agreement with close family friends, the artist Abram Kroll and his wife, Vera, that they would take me into their family if that happened. But my mother wasn't taken away. Later she said that it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kiselev, who saved her. He also helped her find a job at a school. After the verdict was announced, before being sent to the camp, all the convicts were allowed a visit with their relatives. That day became the most shameful day of my life. I refused to go see my father. I was afraid to see him in prisoner's clothes, in shackles. I imagined him tortured, unrecognizable, and I cowardly backed out. Guilt has haunted me my entire life. I deeply regret that decision. But history cannot be rewritten. My father ended up in a dreadful labor camp on the Taishet Highway in Siberia, Irkutsk region, working under inhumane conditions at a timber cutting site. Hard labor and the harsh climate took their toll. He fell seriously ill and barely survived in the camp hospital. His Jewish luck and his profession as a tailor saved him. He was transferred to work in the camp's sewing workshop. Letters from him arrived twice a year. We tried to write as often as possible, sending him a package every month. I became quite skilled at packing because it had to be done in such a way that nothing shook or rattled. My mother wrote letters to all the authorities, and later I joined in. We knocked on every door, traveled to Moscow, and went from office to office. Then came the doctor's plot. It started with inflammatory articles in the newspapers. If the crackdown of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee went unnoticed, this process was accompanied by a thunderous campaign in the newspapers and on the radio. Everyone had to know about the killers in white coats, the poisoners, and participate in their condemnation, branding them with shame. Openly hostile, hate-filled glares followed us, Jews, on the streets, in public transport, in shops, at work. Jewish doctors were expelled from clinics. The slightest inaccuracy in work, or even a baseless accusation, became grounds for legal action. We had a friend, a wonderful pediatrician, Dina Borisovna Goldberg, who had evacuated from Minsk to Sverdlovsk at the start of the war and had stayed there. Mothers trusted her with their children, knowing she could work miracles. And now, this elderly woman was put on trial for a nurse's mistake and sent to a camp. At the school where my mother worked, teachers passionately discussed all this nonsense. One Jewish teacher, turning to my mother, said, "Well, our people can certainly do such a thing. They are capable of anything." That's when my mother, my polite and intelligent mother, who never raised her voice, even at the most unruly students, spoke loudly, addressing the whole teaching staff. "How can you believe in such things? How can doctors, our own doctors, who have cured hundreds, thousands of patients, deliberately poison someone?" It was not so much bravery as a cry of despair, a desire to defend herself, her husband, and all those innocently slandered and convicted. Footnote: the doctor's plot was a Soviet state-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign and conspiracy theory that alleged a cabal of prominent medical specialists, predominantly of Jewish ethnicity, intended to murder leading government and party officials. It was also known as the case of saboteur doctors or killer doctors. The doctor's plot left us in shock. We felt hopeless about any improvement in our fate. But then it came. That day arrived. It was March 5th, 1953. Stalin died. Perhaps no other death has brought so many changes to people's lives, nor instilled so much hope as the death of this terrible man. We, the students of the graduating class, wrote essays about how the sun had set, about our immeasurable grief. We soaked the pages with tears, brought flowers to Stalin's monument in the center of Minsk, standing in long, freezing lines for hours. My friend Valya and I took a huge potted ficus from her house, placed it on a sled, and pulled it all the way there to die in the cold. Such was the depth of our indoctrination to revere the tyrant. But my wise mother said, "Why are you crying, silly girl? It was he who imprisoned your father." A new era was dawning, and the winds of change were sweeping through. But before continuing the story of our family life, I want to share a bit about my school years. After all, it was during those years that my adolescence, my transition from childhood to youth, unfolded. School and college years. My school years can be described as both difficult and joyful. It was difficult for me because I led a double life, trying not to show that a tragedy had befallen my family, that my father was arrested, that my mother and I lived under the weight of fear and anxiety, and that our financial situation was far from comfortable. Later, I found out that my classmates knew everything and spared me, didn't push me away, and protected me as best they could. The teachers knew about it too, especially the school principal, Yulia Isakovna Nissenbaum. In the fall of 1949, I received a harsh reminder that I was the daughter of an enemy of the people. For the October celebrations, we all submitted applications to join the Komsomol, Young Communist League, and our principal gave a letter of recommendation to everyone, except me. The pretext was an unfortunate grade C in physics. But in reality, Yulia Isakovna was protecting me and herself from unnecessary trouble. Oh, how upset I was. I just wanted to be like everyone else and not lag behind. Then, in December, as the entire country prepared to celebrate the leader's 70th birthday, Yulia Isakovna called me and gave her approval for my entry into the Komsomol. She knew that there would be a big wave of applications, and that the regional Komsomol committee wouldn't have time to inquire about my father, who was in prison. So I was admitted to the Komsomol. And yet, those years had their own unique joys. There was the vibrancy of youth and the promise of hope, filled with school events, summer camps, and childhood hobbies. I had wonderful friends who were passionate about theater and music. I couldn't study music myself, so I gleaned knowledge from my friends. Through them, I became acquainted with true art, with literature beyond the school curriculum, and with musical culture. Like them, I tried not to miss any new productions, whether in the drama or opera theaters. I begged my mother to give me money for the touring performances of Lemchev and Kozlovsky, whom we idolized. Poor mother, how she struggled to ensure we had a decent and dignified life. Once again, just like during the war, her pedagogical talent and excellent knowledge of the English language saved us. Her private lessons were always in demand. One day, an interesting woman with a little girl came to see us. She said that their family had recently moved to Minsk, and she was looking for an English language teacher. Someone had recommended my mother to her, and so she came to ask Mom to teach her children. This was Nina Gavrilovna Boleslavskaya, the wife of the renowned chess player Isaac Boleslavsky, who had been invited to Minsk for a coaching position. Mom confessed to Nina that my father had been imprisoned, and that this could negatively impact Boleslavsky's career. Nina responded that if the teacher was good, it didn't matter. We remained lifelong friends with the Boleslavsky family, and through them, we also became friends with the family of chess player Alexei Sokolsky. Neither of them was afraid to associate with a disgraced family. Mom told me that if I wanted to dress well, I needed to learn how to sew. So I joined a sewing and tailoring club at the Palace of Pioneers, even though I preferred singing and dancing. I learned a few things and started sewing my own calico dresses, skirts, and sundresses. But what I was especially good at was mending various items. I patched up my one fancy dress so skillfully that no one could tell it had been damaged. Instead of hiding it, I proudly boasted about my high-level craftsmanship and showed it off to everyone. Patching elbows on my school uniform became a routine task. Our school was an all-girls school, jokingly referred to as the second female monastery. Occasionally, we were allowed to invite boys from neighboring boys' schools to our events, or attend theirs. At these events, we girls stood in one corner, the boys in another, scrutinizing each other. Mostly the girls danced with each other. Only the bravest boys dared to invite girls to dance, and, under the watchful eyes of teachers and students, heroically made their way across the room. Afterward, the teachers would inevitably remind us, "You don't have time to study, but you have time for boys." Our school was strict. In physics class, we were afraid not only to talk, but even to breathe. We frantically flipped through our textbooks, while our physics teacher, Lazar Isakovich Rabinovich, paced the room with long strides, repeating, "Who's talking?" Whoever is talking will go to the board, even though there was dead silence. When Nelia Kagan went to the board, it was like a performance every time. Classmates would whisper the answers to her, and she would repeat them out loud, prompting Lazar to say, "Why are you repeating like a bird?" To which she would indignantly reply, "Are you saying I'm a parrot?" In chemistry class, our teacher, Maria Ivanovna, handed out microscopic strips of paper with 3 questions written in tiny handwriting, leaving no time for chatter as we rushed to write our answers. Our geography teacher, Bella Markovna, called us all little geographers and drilled us so thoroughly that we knew the map like the back of our hands. Indeed, our school gave us a good education, though it also frayed our nerves considerably. But my fondest memories are from our school productions. We organized them ourselves, without any help from the teachers, even overcoming their resistance. We put on plays, performing both female and male roles, and held literary and musical evenings dedicated to Pushkin, Tchaikovsky, and Chekhov. We wrote the scripts ourselves, sang, and recited poetry. The school curriculum often seemed designed to kill our love for literature and music, yet many of us carried that love throughout our lives. I finished school in 1953, after Stalin's death, but the times were still harsh. I couldn't even think about applying to a university in Minsk, because I had to mention my father in my application, and he was then a prisoner in a distant Siberian camp. Mom and I came up with what we thought was a very clever phrasing. We wrote that my father was not living with the family, so I applied to the Goretsky Agricultural Academy since I loved biology and chemistry. The academy was located in a small regional center where we hoped the vigilant eye of the KGB would not often look. Of course, that watchful eye peered into every corner, but it turned out that this educational institution was a refuge not just for me. Many of the professors were from Leningrad and Moscow. These were excellent educators who were banned from living in large cities due to a stain of unreliability on their records. It was said that the physics teacher had once been a Denikin officer, and the mathematics professor had been a member of the cadet party, and so on. They had settled in this town and were teaching the basics of science to future agronomists and kolkhoz chairmen. Footnote: a Denikin officer refers to an officer who served under General Anton Denikin, a prominent leader of the White Army during the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922. The White Army fought against the Bolshevik Red Army, advocating for the restoration of the old regime and opposing the communist government established after the October Revolution. Being a Denikin officer implies involvement with the anti-Bolshevik forces, which would have been viewed negatively by the Soviet authorities, leading to a stigmatization and restrictions on their post-war lives. Footnote: a member of the Cadet Party refers to someone who is part of the Constitutional Democratic Party, commonly known as the Cadet Party, which was a liberal political party in the early 20th century Russia, advocating for constitutional democracy, civil rights, and a parliamentary system. After the revolution, members of the Cadet Party were often persecuted by the Bolsheviks, as the party was associated with opposition to the Soviet regime. There, I heard about Beria's downfall, and I sensed the impending changes, still indistinct, but already palpable. For me, a girl from an urban family and a central city school, it was difficult to adapt to life in the dormitory and to the unique mix of students, many of whom came from remote Belarusian villages. I was placed in a room with 10 other girls. They were in their 3rd year and had already accumulated some household items: pots, basins, and dishes. Bedspreads and pillows with ruffles and lace were considered particularly chic. At night, they would curl their hair with papillotes. Our entire room celebrated holidays and birthdays together. From the vegetable science department, we would bring beets and carrots, potatoes and pork fat were our own, and we would prepare a huge basin of vinaigrette salad. We would invite boys from the all-male departments of mechanics and hydromechanics. Both hosts and guests feasted on the salad, indulged in fruit berry wine and vodka, and then everyone would go to the dance. The large foyer of the main academic building would be so packed with dance enthusiasts that there was hardly any room to move. This shuffling in place was called dancing. After the dances, we returned to the dormitory where in total darkness, the lights were turned off after midnight. We would hang out by the windowsills, and in the summer, we would wander through the old shady park, and the romantic dates would continue. Then there would be dramas and disputes, and we even had a saying, "The union marries them off." This meant that the situation urgently required the intervention of the community. From the very first days of school, I found an activity close to my heart. I joined the amateur performing arts group. My friend Alla and I formed a duet. She had an excellent second voice. Additionally, we looked very much alike, both short, chubby, and both loved to sing. We were taken to nearby villages and clubs in all kinds of weather, whether it was freezing cold or sweltering heat, and we sang. People even recognized us on the street, and boys would tease us, but we were very proud of it. Among my classmates were girls who had left their villages for the first time. We decided to introduce them to culture, but we did it in our own unique way. For example, one night we cut off a girl's braid, which looked more like a rat's tail, and for another, we trimmed the long sleeves of her summer dress to make it more fashionable. In the fall, my mother came to visit me. She was shocked by what she saw: the overcrowded dormitory, the wild parties, and the frequent fights that often escalated into knife brawls. After that visit, my mother resolved to transfer me to Minsk University at all costs, specifically to the Faculty of Biology and Soil Science. I transferred there to begin my second year, and soon my mother was also invited to work there as a lecturer. I graduated from the university in 1958. But before continuing the story of my family's life, I want to reminisce a little more about my college years. Potatoes. Every year, we went to the potato fields, starting from the first year at the Goretsky Academy, and no refusals or excuses. I remember every field trip as if it were yesterday. In my freshman year, my friend Ina Voinova and I were quartered with an elderly man who was a bit hard of hearing and nearly blind. He sat on the stove with his legs dangling, incredibly delighted to have unexpected listeners, and began his lecture. The greatest man was Stolypin. Lenin was all right too. But Stalin? He's a dirty Jew, and all the rest of them are dirty Jews too. At night, we were bitten by every insect you could possibly find in the village. Just one night spent there was enough to make us struggle for a long time to get rid of these pests back at the dormitory. For meals, everyone was fed in a single hut where a large basin of food was placed on the table. It was a thick soup, a mishmash of first and second courses. You would scoop a big spoonful, using bread to help. Quickly bring it to your mouth and swallow it, burning yourself in the process. The second spoonful could be savored a bit longer. Of course, I couldn't keep up. I lacked skill, being too much of a city girl. The hostess saw that I wasn't suited to this way of eating, took pity on me, found a chipped little plate, and served me separately. In each subsequent year, there was a different potato duty. Although we didn't always harvest potatoes, there were flax and grain sorting tasks as well. For me, the most challenging task was indeed the potato harvest. We did it the old-fashioned way. An old man would walk behind a horse with a plow to turn over the furrow. And we, with our buckets, would bend over to pick up the potatoes that had been unearthed, shaking off clumps of soil and trying not to miss any. I was terrible at it. My hand could only hold 2 potatoes. When I grabbed a third, the first one would fall out. I was always lagging behind. I got a bit better with practice, but I never became a top performer in potato harvesting. Footnote: in the Soviet Union, potato duty required college students to assist with the annual potato harvest in the countryside. This mandatory task involved leaving their studies to work long hours in rural fields, fostering a sense of community and providing essential labor for collective farms. As biology students, we put all the innovations of agricultural science into practice in the field. In peat muck pots, we used our fingers to create holes for seedlings to ensure consistent depth. We planted corn using a square nest method. A team of 4 people walked along a furrow. The first person dug a hole with a shovel. The second placed a piece of manure in the hole. The third placed 2 to 3 corn kernels on the manure. And the fourth covered these precious seeds with another piece of manure, then tamped down the hole with their foot. That's how we contributed to the country's agricultural development. And when we later decided to make silage from branches, we cut down and composted countless shrubs. Of course, it's not just the potato fields that I remember from my student years. One unforgettable experience was the summer field practice at the biological station by Lake Naroch. It was a wonderful and joyful time. We stayed in summer cottages along the shore of the most beautiful lake in Belarus, where we swam and sunbathed, running straight into the sand from our cabins. We pooled our resources for food, mainly living on Naroch pike, which we bought from fishermen, rowing out to them practically to the middle of the lake. Our diet also included pasta and Narochin chunk, canned food, a culinary delicacy. Once, we decided to treat ourselves and bought a live calf. We tied it up on the lawn near our cottages. At first, it peacefully grazed on the grass, but then it broke free, perhaps sensing the fate that awaited it. Our entire group searched for it through the forests and fields. Eventually, we found it and ate the poor calf. The practical internship at the collective farm, the kolkhoz, on the other hand, was anything but idyllic. It was a grueling challenge. We created soil maps, dug soil pits, and carried samples for analysis, along with shovels, maps, food, and water across the fields. Digging trenches in clay soil was especially difficult. The shovels simply wouldn't penetrate the hard ground. Since there were only 2 guys in our class, the girls had to do everything themselves. There were also some amusing situations. The locals sometimes mistook my friend and me for schoolgirls, pioneers, because we looked so young, or even for spies, as we were constantly jotting things down in our notebooks. When they discovered that we were digging pits to create maps, they would ask us to find something useful, like salt, so they could build a factory and provide jobs for everyone. Based on the results of our 2-year practical internship, we wrote our thesis papers. By that time, a soil science institute had been established, and all the graduates from our course were hired there, except for me, the only Jew. Although things eventually worked out, that painful scar remained with me for life. But I'll come back to that later. Papa's return. I got a bit sidetracked and shared stories about my school and college years. Let me return to the story of my family's life. After Stalin's death, letters from my father started arriving more frequently. As he later recounted, the regime in the camp became somewhat more lenient, and the treatment of political prisoners grew more humane, if such a thing was even possible there. The most significant event of that time was when my mother received permission to visit my father. She embarked on a long journey across the entire country with numerous layovers. From the camp, She brought back detailed information about the absurd charges brought against my father and the inquisitorial methods used to extract confessions from the detainees. What a heroic woman my mother was. I almost never saw her cry or appear lost. She was always organized, composed, tastefully dressed, and commanded respect from everyone she worked with or taught. She was a natural-born educator. And right after Stalin's death, she was invited to work at Minsk University, where she started teaching senior students and postgraduates. Life was changing in every aspect. Even our living situation improved. We were given a different room, in the same building, still small, but better. It's worth noting that as the political climate shifted, so did our living conditions. We lived and evolved together with the changes happening in the country. At that time, Khrushchev's letter exposing Stalin's cult of personality was published. Later, we learned significantly more than what was revealed in that letter. But back then, those were the first words of truth, the initial shocking facts about the history of our country and the lives of the party elite. It was like a bombshell. We, students and teachers, sat in a large auditorium, holding our breaths as we listened. Afterwards, we walked the streets near the university all night, discussing, debating, and bewildering at how this could have happened. How it was possible that an entire nation had been deceived. Its finest citizens were eliminated, while those who knew something were too terrified to speak out. In February 1956, Papa returned home. He was welcomed not only by Mama and me, but also by our best friends. The reunion was emotional, joyful. A tired, thinner Papa stepped out of the train. I was very anxious, unsure of how he would react to seeing me, now grown up and changed. Papa, too, was nervous about the reunion. After all, he had been taken away from home when I was a 6th grade schoolgirl with braids, and now I was a junior in college. We laughed and cried. The ice had melted, and we were together again. We were living in a small room back then, with 2 narrow beds, a table, and a wardrobe crammed in. We had to squeeze a folding cot into the space, which I slept on, and no one could get up until I put it away. Friends would come over, share in our joy of my father's return, and ask him questions. I can't say that my father was eager to share his memories. Rather, he wanted to erase those years from his mind. But of course, that was impossible. In his release papers from the camp, it was stated that Isaac Heimovich Platner, of Jewish nationality, was released due to the cessation of his case and was returning to his place of residence. That was it. As if those long 7 years of interrogations, beatings in prison, humiliations and torture, sleepless nights, and forced labor in the logging camp never happened. As if the family hadn't suffered, living in constant fear. After my father returned, a fellow camp inmate tracked him down. Unfortunately, I don't remember his last name, only that his first name was Arkady. He was a naval captain who ended up in the camp after the war, also under the charge of treason against the motherland. He wrote letters first to my father, and after my father's death, he continued the correspondence with my mother, sending photographs. He later wrote that he got married and had a daughter. He also wrote that it was only thanks to my father that he retained his human dignity, faith in justice, the will to live, and the desire to prove his innocence. He said that the friendship and communication with my father prevented him from becoming a bitter prisoner who had lost his humanity. How unfortunate that we later lost touch with him. My father returned from prison, a very ill man, and was often hospitalized. When he was home, doctors from the Litvand Clinic and the emergency services were frequent visitors. Nothing could compensate for this. Neither the one-time allowance given to him upon his return from the labor camp, with which we bought our first refrigerator, nor the sanatorium vouchers, nor even the long-awaited apartment we finally received. We were given 2 rooms in a 3-room apartment. Our neighbor was a quiet, solitary man, a re-emigrant from Canada. Of course, he was an inconvenience to us, and we were not the easiest neighbors for him either. But we lived together amicably, respecting each other. Despite his severe illness, my father worked a lot during those years. As I go through his archive, I am amazed by the bright, optimistic poems he wrote after his return. The titles speak for themselves. Under the Sunny Sky, Song of Joy, Children's Laughter, Spring. There were also reflective poems about the meaning of life, his fate, love, and loyalty. He even recorded the poems he had composed in the prison camp, which he had carried in his memory. Most of these poems were never published. The book of poems, titled The Salt of Life, published in 1957 in Belarusian, was dedicated by my father to my mother. On the title page, he wrote, "Dedicated to Deborah." Yes, there's no need to shy away from emphatic words. My mother was the only woman in his entire life, his faithful companion. Even though I never saw outward displays of tenderness or affection, I always felt the unity of their souls and thoughts. My mother was always the first listener and the sternest critic of all my father's works. Thanks to her support and strength of spirit, he survived all those years in the prison camp. His final work was a collection of memories about his deceased friends, Moishe Kulbuk, Zelik Axelrod, Eli Kagan, Hirsch Kamenetsky, and Grigory Berezkin, which, unfortunately, also remained unpublished. Hirsch Kamenetsky, a wonderful poet and my father's close friend, was arrested around the same time as my father and was held in the same prison on Volodarsky Street. He was released a little earlier than my father due to a severe illness. He had an advanced case of tuberculosis. After his return, he lived only a short while and passed away in the hospital. My father mourned his death deeply. Grisha Berezkin was also arrested in 1949 and was held in the same prison on Volodarsky Street. However, this was his second arrest. The first time he was arrested was in April 1941, along with Eli Kagan and Zelik Axelrod. 2 years earlier, these young writers had written a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belarus, requesting that Jewish schools in Western Belarus not be closed, and that at least some of the already closed schools in other regions be reopened. This act of bravery was not well received. They were arrested just before the war. When the Germans were advancing on Minsk, they were taken out of prison and divided into political prisoners and common criminals. The common criminals were released, but the political prisoners, those who were not even convicted yet, but only under investigation, were taken into the woods and shot. Thus, 32-year-old Zelik Axelrod perished, while 23-year-old Grisha miraculously survived as a bullet merely grazed him. He made his way east, reported to the military enlistment office, and joined the active army. He fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, was wounded, and was decorated with numerous orders and medals. But in 1949, he was arrested again. When he was brought to the investigator, the latter opened a folder and said, "So, where did we leave off?" "Ah, yes, we made a mistake. You're not a German spy. You're an American one. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Prison, war, prison again, then a labor camp. Thus passed the best, most promising years of this talented book critic. How many unfulfilled hopes, unwritten works, and losses were endured during those years. Neither my father nor Grisha liked to recall the years spent in captivity, but when they met, we sensed an invisible bond between them. Something beyond our understanding. Something more profound than mere friendship. Grisha was a guest at my wedding, later got married himself, and we became neighbors. Our children grew up together, became friends, and attended each other's birthday parties. After his return from the labor camp, my father was unable to publish any books in Yiddish. They simply wouldn't print them. However, he developed good relationships with many Belarusian poets. They translated his works, and a few books were published in the Belarusian language. During this period, I felt closer to him. I had likely grown more mature. I developed a keen interest in his work and a desire to assist him. We began working together on literal translations. To our great joy, we found we were quite successful at it. My father would read his poems to me in Yiddish, and I would choose the most appropriate Russian words to accurately convey his thoughts. Poets who later used these translations said they found them easy and convenient to work with. In the preface to my father's last book of poems, Songs About Bread, published in Belarusian in 1986, the editor and translator, poet Arthur Volsky, wrote these kind words about my father. I remember the soft contours of his face, hair smoothly combed back, still quite thick, but completely gray, and his eyes. I don't remember exactly what color they were, but now, after all this time, his eyes seem blue to me. Indeed, blue, and not any other color, because they held so much light, purity, and genuine kindness. And his ability to listen and empathize, his tactfulness. The last months of my father's life were illuminated by the birth of his granddaughter. When he held her in his arms and she gently touched his cheek with her tiny hands, he was truly happy. However, my difficult childbirth took a toll on his health. I almost died during delivery. Later, my parents went to a sanatorium in Palanga. The doctors should have warned us that he should not only avoid long journeys, but also refrain from any sudden movements. But neither I nor my mother were aware of this. And in Palanga, a tragedy occurred. He suffered a stroke caused by a thrombosis of the brain vessels, also known as cerebral thrombosis, and passed away on July 26, 1961. At that time in Moscow, 2 of my father's poetry books were being prepared for publication: The Salt of Life by Soviet Writer Publishing House, and The Rooster and the Locomotive by Detgies. These were his first eagerly awaited books in Russian, which had taken a great deal of his strength and energy. The Salt of Life was released with a wonderful foreword by the poet Lev Ozerov, featuring his beautiful translations. Other translators included Elena Axelrod, Anatoly Yakobson, David Brodsky, Pavel Kobzarevsky, and Pavel Antokolsky. These names speak volumes. The children's poems were translated by V. Tushnova and A. Gondgov. Each book boasted beautiful design. The advance copies arrived after my parents had already left for the sanatorium, so my husband and I immediately sent them there in a package, knowing how much joy they would bring my father. But our package arrived on the very day of his passing. Such a tragedy. My father was not destined to see these books, hold them in his hands, and take delight in them. We received the dreadful news early in the morning by phone. Vanya Efimovna Aller, the director of Litfond, quickly and efficiently organized our trip to Palanga. Our journey there and back was filled with drama. Accompanied by a severe thunderstorm, lightning struck a tree and split it moments after we passed by. The Writers' Union of Belarus organized the funeral, and my father was buried in Minsk at the Moscow Eastern Cemetery. Our little Lenuchka, who was then 3.5 months old, helped us get through that difficult time. Later, our second daughter was born, and we named her Irina, in memory of my father, after the first letter of his name, Isaac. When she grew a bit older, she was very surprised that her grandfather didn't know about her existence and felt upset when her older sister bragged, "Grandpa knew me, but he didn't know you." I had already mentioned that I graduated from university in 1958, but I couldn't find a job. My father was still alive, but how could he help me? He was sick and had just returned from the labor camp. I faced numerous humiliations and rejections from various institutions, despite having a good diploma and a relevant specialization in soil biology. My thesis advisor was none other than the president of the Agricultural Academy, Lupinovich. He praised my thesis and gave it an excellent grade, but did not want to hire me, even though the Institute of Soil Science was expanding at that time and had accepted all my classmates. It was a stroke of luck and some high-level connections that helped me. When I next went to see Lupinovich, he suddenly recognized me, shook my hand, and exclaimed, "We are short of people, and such specialists are without a job." That's how I got my first job. Later, I changed jobs several times, and for the last 17 years, before retiring, I worked in the laboratory of the Project Institute of Reclamation and Water Management. I managed to sneak into this institute, almost illegally, while the director, who wasn't very fond of Jews, was on vacation. Our institute focused on water management issues and designed drainage systems for Belarusian swamps. When the Chernobyl disaster occurred, we were among the first to address its aftermath, and we began receiving soil, peat, and water samples from the Chernobyl zone. Initially, we had no protection, and when we demanded radiation level measurements and protective measures, we were assured there was no danger and accused of being alarmists. It was only after radiation became a topic of widespread concern, with newspapers and television showing footage from Chernobyl and reporting on people dying from radiation sickness, that a specialized laboratory was established and its staff began receiving hazard pay. This was a typical example of our negligence and complacency. I want to share more about our laboratory. At none of my previous jobs had I encountered so many elderly Jewish women. Rosa Moiseyevna, Esya Meyerovna, Mary Israelevna, Anna Grigorievna, and 2 Sophias, Bella, and soon I joined this close-knit team. The project department's work and our bonuses depended on the timely delivery of analysis results, so the pressure was high. However, our laboratory was not only known for its hard work, but also for its wonderful celebrations. There were plenty of occasions: the 20th anniversary of the laboratory, then the 25th, the 50th birthday of our head, and the retirement parties for veterans. These were grand feasts, and receiving an invitation to them was considered an honor. Employees from other departments eagerly sought to attend our celebrations, because our tables were always overflowing with culinary delights. Our Rosas, Bellas, and Sophias demonstrated their exceptional culinary skills. Preparations began well in advance of the events, and a few days before the celebrations, the main cooks were relieved of their regular duties to focus solely on the kitchen. However, as products gradually began to disappear from stores, and as our veterans, as well as our chief organizer and head of the department, retired, the feasts came to an end. Here's another little anecdote about our wonderful laboratory. Every month, Rosa Moiseyevna and I had to attend seminars at the Communist Party Education House, Rosushka being the only party member in the laboratory and I the political informant. During these seminars, Rosa would peacefully doze off, while I diligently took notes on all the lectures to report back during our political briefings. This was considered a serious matter. We had to arrive 15 minutes early on Mondays and actively participate. On party congress days, we had to read lengthy multi-page reports by Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, which were printed in long, narrow columns, running down the entire newspaper page. I would read strip after strip, until I suddenly realized I had lost my place in the text and was repeating myself. "Girls," I said, "why didn't you tell me I was repeating?" And they replied, "As if we were actually listening to what you were reading?" So it wasn't just work and feasts that occupied our time and our minds. We also actively participated in political life and were well versed in party ideology. The years passed, our children grew up, and we grew older. On May 1st, International Workers' Day, my family had its own celebration. The birthdays of my mother, my husband, and my husband's sister. However, everyone was required to attend the demonstration on this day. I tried to refuse, but no excuses were accepted. Attendance was mandatory. End of discussion. Thus, this joyous spring day turned into an obstacle course. We had to march up and down Leninsky Avenue on foot, at best empty-handed, but at worst carrying a banner. And then it was back to the kitchen, hosting guests, and tackling piles of dishes. I can't say that we celebrated all Jewish holidays at home, but we always had matzah for Passover. Every year, my mother forgot the phone number to call for the order, but we remembered that matzah was Matvey Borisovich. An errand boy would come from him, take a bag of flour, and quickly disappear. After a while, he would return with a cardboard box of matzah and vanish again. It was a ritual fraught with risk, since the matzah was baked clandestinely. Korolishchevichi. I want to reminisce about a very special and dear place where we often spent our summer vacations with the children, the Writers' Union of Belarus Dacha in Korolishchevichi. It's located not far from Minsk along the Mogilov Highway. The beautiful house, surrounded by verandas and covered in wild grapevines, had a lawn in front of it, and beyond that, a thick mossy forest filled with berries and mushrooms encircled the house like a wall. Someone lived in the house year-round. In winter, it was usually occupied by writers. School children's camps were organized there during the winter holidays, and in summer, it was mainly the writers' wives, sunbathing and swinging in hammocks, while their children and grandchildren played in the forest. Every morning, Maria Isakovna Badulya would emerge into the clearing, dressed in a tracksuit, sporting a magnificent, wide-brimmed straw hat, and holding a long stick. She would do her stretching exercises, which she called a workout. While everyone was just waking up and getting ready for breakfast in the dining hall, Vera Yosefovna Sobolenko, an expert on mushrooms, a true mushroom encyclopedia, would already be returning from the forest with a full basket of them. My husband and I tried to keep up, often leading the way in berry and mushroom picking. Some of the less quick-witted ladies threatened to find out where we were leaving our empty half-liter jars each day and retrieving them filled with fresh, fragrant wild strawberries. We dried mushrooms on a lamp, threading them on strings, though we were always worried that the superintendent might see it and cause a fuss. In the evenings, we would light bonfires, sing songs, and share jokes, with Anya Krasnoperka being a true specialist in the latter. Often, Yanka Brill, Mykola Tatur, and Vasil Vitka would join us around the fire. Sometimes dinner would turn into an evening of reminiscences. How fascinating it was to listen to Mykola Hvedorovich, Grisha Berezkin, and Volodya Nahomkin. These were unforgettable gatherings. The house we lived in used to be the dacha of Yakub Kolis. Some overzealous official took the initiative to surround a large spruce tree along the path to the dining hall with chains, placed flower vases around it, and hung a sign stating that Yakub Kolis loved to rest under this tree. In response, the local jokers hung another sign on a large spruce on the opposite side of the path, indicating that under this tree, Yakub Kolis loved to, well, you can guess what. A half-hour walk from the house, deep in the forest, there was a small lake. As a biologist, I could observe the process of bogging, or swamp formation. It became increasingly overgrown with grass and shrubs, and the area covered by water decreased year by year. In the early years, the children loved to skate there in winter, but eventually, the lake became so shallow that we often saw clear moose tracks on the frozen surface. The lake even earned a name, Moose Lake. Although this dacha wasn't the most comfortable place to stay, and we had to go to great lengths to get vouchers for it, we have warm memories of it, as with most things associated with our youth. Our departure to Israel. The year 1990 arrived, marking a great turning point in our lives. Sleepless nights, endless conversations, discussions, doubts, and finally, a decision. I'd like to recount our departure with a touch of humor, but we'll see how it goes. We left for Israel in strict accordance with the popular jokes of the time. To take an umbrella or not to take an umbrella. That was us, because describing what we brought with us is a joke in itself. For instance, we brought a completely awful vodka that was dangerously undrinkable, but it was so hard to come by that we couldn't leave it behind. We took things we never used in our new life and left behind many things that would have been useful here. But what's the point in dwelling on that? We strictly followed the advice from a joke where one Jew tells another, "I don't know what you're talking about, but you need to go." Especially since it wasn't just 2 or 3 Jews, but all our acquaintances and loved ones who started packing up and like migratory birds, flying off to distant lands. Vera Kroll left with her daughter's family, the Asanovskys, the entire large Korolishchevichi family, my daughter's friends, and many, many others. The final push that made us take the decisive step was a visit from our neighbor, Nelly Fyodorovna, with whom we had lived on the same floor for 33 years. She came to us and said that if the rumors about Jewish pogroms turned out to be true, they were ready to protect us, but we would need to make it to their apartment in time. It was then that we realized 2 elderly neighbors wouldn't be able to protect us, and there would be nowhere for us to hide in our own Minsk, even though deep down, we didn't believe in such a nightmarish turn of events. I won't pretend that we went to Israel out of conviction, or because we knew the country well and had a clear idea of what awaited us, but we knew very well the country we were leaving, where most of our lives had been spent. We always considered, and still consider it, our homeland. But to it, we were always stepchildren. Isn't that so? We pushed through such obstacles that now, looking back, we are amazed at how we overcame it all. We endured multi-day queues at the OVIR, Visa and Registration Office, the Passport Office, the Housing and Utilities Office, the Embassy, and the ticket counter. But we were seasoned fighters, and no queue could scare us, because we grew up in them. We were raised in them. If our departure had gone smoothly, without queues, we would have thought something was wrong, as it would have seemed too easy. My childhood was dominated by standing in long lines, for bread, for all kinds of food, first with ration cards, and later without them. Queues for women's boots could last for hours, and we had to write our number in line on our hands, while getting furniture was even more difficult. Queues for furniture could last for days, weeks, or even months. You had to register your name with the sotnik. Footnote: the term sotnik is derived from the word sto, which means 100. In the context of Soviet queues, a sotnik was an unofficial term used for a person who organized and managed a list of 100 people in queues for scarce goods like furniture. This person would maintain a list of people waiting for the item and keep track of their place in line, often by writing numbers on their hands or noting their names in a ledger. This system arose due to the frequent shortages and long waits for many consumer goods. We traded waste paper for books by classic and popular authors, attending roll calls for months on end. Footnote: roll calls are a way to take attendance, typically by calling out names to ensure everyone is present. In the context of standing in line or queuing, roll calls involve periodically checking the presence of those in the queue to maintain their place or number in line. Once, a terrible incident occurred. The shed that served as a collection point for waste paper burned down, and the queue members repaired the shed themselves to keep the process going. We also had unforgettable evenings at the Stolichny grocery store. You'll be behind me in the meat line, and I'll be behind you in the sausage line. We even jokingly said, let's find another line to join, so we don't have to part ways. That's how close we became. When we finally left for Israel, it was after enduring the longest queue yet, as we were at the peak of the emigration wave, at the end of June 1991. In Minsk, we left behind the graves of my father and my husband Leonid's mother. I want to say a few heartfelt words about my mother-in-law, Leah Lvovna. I was truly fortunate to have her as my mother-in-law. She was a wonderful woman who immediately accepted me and loved my parents. She faced many trials in her life. Her father was arrested in 1937 and executed as a Polish spy. Her mother and younger sister died in the Minsk ghetto, and she always blamed herself for not being able to save them. After the war, she separated from her husband and raised my husband, Leonid, and his older sister Zoya on her own, enabling them to pursue higher education and helping them build successful lives. I was always amazed at her ability to get along with people. She had good relationships with her colleagues, neighbors, daughter-in-law, and son-in-law. She was truly a wise woman. She passed away in Minsk at the age of 84 when we were already living in Israel. We honor her memory. My mother lived to the age of 93, outliving my father by 37 years. When she became a widow, she was not even 60 yet. She remained devoted to his memory and did everything possible to preserve his literary legacy and publish his poems, which was no easy task. After my father's death, several of his books were published in Belarusian, and children's books were translated into Polish and Czech. In 1970, his book, The Salt of Life, was published in Yiddish. The last book, Songs About Bread, a small but beautifully published work in Belarusian, came out in 1986. My mother performed a remarkable feat by coming with us at such an advanced age. She was 88 years old. The reunion with relatives, her only surviving brother, and the warm reception and love from nieces and nephews gave her new strength and extended her years. She raised 2 granddaughters and lived to see her great-grandchildren. The youngest was born in Israel. Mother passed away in Jerusalem, and that's where she is buried. Not a day goes by without us remembering her. A significant part of life has passed. Many events have occurred over the years, but the most significant was our move to Israel. I believe that if my father had been alive, he would have certainly come here with us. Back in 1948, when the State of Israel was proclaimed, he enthusiastically welcomed the news and closely followed the events in the young state, even though the information reaching us was very scarce and one-sided. In Israel, we practically started life anew with a clean slate. Everything changed. The country, the climate, our status, our outlook on life. For now, I will continue my reminiscences, or perhaps someone from the next generation will take over. Epilogue. I really want to time the release of this book of my memoirs to coincide with a significant date for us. In April 2010, my husband, Leonid Alexeyev, and I are celebrating our golden wedding anniversary. 50 years together. And this is how we met. In our student years, festival nights were very fashionable events on college campuses. We, the girls from the almost exclusively female biology faculty of Minsk University, were eager to attend these events at the Polytechnic Institute. These parties always featured a concert of student performances and dancing till you drop. I loved to dance and was quite good at it. Many people invited me to dance, but then Leonid appeared and outshined all the other suitors. He would escort me home. Then we would walk to his house, and then back to mine. And all the while, he would read me poems, weave some nonsense, and I would just laugh. For 2 years, we met almost every day, except for the period when Leonid went on his trip to the Virgin Lands. I wore glasses back then and felt very self-conscious about it. Whenever I approached our meeting place, I would take off my glasses and hide them in my purse. He would see this from a distance and move to another spot. Footnote: trips to the Virgin Lands were part of the Soviet Virgin Lands campaign. This campaign, initiated by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s, involved sending volunteers, often young people and students, to cultivate and develop previously uncultivated and uninhabited lands in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and other regions. These trips were a significant part of Soviet history, aiming to increase agricultural production, and were seen as a patriotic duty by many participants. 2 years later, we got married on the anniversary of our first meeting, and have celebrated that day every year since. I attended Leonid's thesis defense presentation with our 1-year-old daughter Lena, and later, our daughter Irina was born. All these years, we were always together, doing everything side by side, raising our children, renovating our apartment, assembling furniture, and later, helping to raise our grandchildren. In his career, Leonid rose to the ranks to become the head of a large department at one of Minsk's leading enterprises, the Granat Association, where he developed robotic systems. When our daughters decided to move to Israel, we supported them wholeheartedly and followed them. Here in Israel, we faced the challenges of adapting to a new life together, rejoiced in the successes of our children and grandchildren, and actively participated in the vibrant life of new immigrants, Olim. And so, we have lived to see our golden wedding anniversary. May this book be a gift to our entire family on this occasion. You have listened to The Way My Life Turned Out by Jessica Platner. This audiobook was narrated by Brianne Bushes. Russian to English translation assisted by OpenAI's ChatGPT-4. Translation supervision and audio editing by Alon Gerba. Mixing and mastering by Joshua Roth. Executive produced by Alon Gerba. Original copyright 2010 by Jessica Platner. All rights reserved. The following musical compositions were used in this audiobook. Oh, If It Could Last Forever, from 12 Persian Songs, composed by Anton Rubinstein, performed by Fyodor Shalapin. The Star-Spangled Banner, the U.S. National Anthem, composed by John Stafford Smith, performed by Wedding String Quartet. National Anthem of the USSR, composed by Alexander Alexandrov, performed by Organic Spark. Music and sound effects from the film Sounds of War, Voices of Heroes, produced by Leningrad TV, 1966. It's All the Same, written by Caesar Solodar and composed by Yuri Milutin, performed by Nina Tarasova. Dark is the Night, written by Vladimir Agatov and composed by Nikita Bogoslavsky, performed by Mark Bernes in the Soviet film Two Soldiers, 1943. Lullaby, written by Vasily Lebedev-Kumich and composed by Isaac Dunayevsky, performed by Solomon Mihoils in the Soviet film Circus, 1936. Ma Nishtana, the Jewish Passover song, performed by Boris Savchuk. Hatikva, National Anthem of the State of Israel, written by Naftali Hertz Imber, melody adapted by Samuel Cohen, performed by the Israel Philharmonic. Thank you for listening.